Welcome to Season 6 of the Hey Girl podcast with your host and my mom, Bethany Needham. This season, we get to hear stories from guests who are running their race in their place right where God has them. We hope that these stories will encourage and inspire you to do the same. If you want more information or to connect with my mom, go follow us on Instagram at HeyGirlGram, friend us on Facebook at HeyGirlPod, or even better, head to BethanyNeedham.com and sign up for our email list so that you can get all the Hey Girl tea. All right, it's time to grab a cup of coffee or your favorite seltzer. Here's my mom.
Hey girls, and welcome back to another episode of the Hey Girl podcast. This week, I sit down with Katie Davis Majors, and what an incredible treat it was to meet her face to face, to talk through some of the amazing things that God has done in her life and is continuing to do through her story. Man, I cannot wait to share this with you. But before we get into the episode this week, I just want to take a minute to share with you the heart behind Hey Girl Fitness, which we have talked about in episodes before this. And we mentioned our My Mountain Challenge that has officially launched. But for those of you who maybe were like, I don't know if My Mountain Challenge is really for me, but you're in this space where you know that part of taking care of yourself is taking care of your body. So here's the deal. When I was a young mama, I walked into a gym for the first time and was so scared and overwhelmed. I had no idea, honestly, how to even turn on a treadmill. It was bad. But this incredible trainer came alongside of me and was so helpful in setting out this plan that was specific to me. It was nothing crazy. It was learning things a little bit at a time. And slowly over time, I started to see progress, not just in my body or weight, though those things are fun to see improvement and progress, but honestly, in my mental health and my energy and all the things. And really, that story is what fuels my passion for Hey Girl Fitness and creating a space where I can come alongside other women who may be also feeling overwhelmed or afraid or like, I don't even know where to start. So, if you've been thinking about it, but you haven't done it yet, I just want to encourage you to head on over to my website, BethanyNeedham.com. You'll find a link for Hey Girl Fitness and figure out what fits best for you. There's all kinds of options, from just having access to our workout library to a fitness assessment with me personally, where we sit on a Zoom call and we talk through what are your goals? What are the things that you like to do? And we set up a plan that makes sense for you and your place in your race. So again, BethanyNeedham.com, head on over, check it out, and sign up today. So if you don't already have your snuggly blanket and your seltzer, go ahead and grab it, because this next conversation is going to go down in the books as just one of my favorites, because I'm a bit of a fangirl, not going to lie. I hope you enjoy this talk with Katie Davis Majors. Okay, listeners, I am here today with a new friend, as in we just met seconds ago. How are you today?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to be here.
I am so thrilled to have you on the podcast. And I'm not sure how many of our listeners, I assume a good number of them will recognize your name. Maybe they have read one of the books you've written. I know Kisses from Katie, obviously, is one, at least I feel like is a common one that people have heard of. You have the Daring to Hope, which actually I just finished reading and really, really loved. And then your newest book, Safe All Along. And obviously, we're going to get to a little bit of that. But I just want to start with, if somebody, say they're listening and they're like, I have not heard of Katie and her story, maybe you can just kind of introduce yourself to some of our listeners.
Well, I'm Katie, and my husband and I have had the privilege of being missionaries in Uganda for about the last 15 years. Until about a year and a half ago, we moved back to the United States. We moved here with our large family. So we have, over the years, we had adopted 13 daughters, and then we have 2 sons. And we are now all here in the United States after 15 years of living overseas. So I founded a ministry in Uganda, East Africa, called Amazima Ministries. We do discipleship through education. So we have Christian schools. Our desire is that students come to know and love the Lord by using education as a vehicle for discipleship of both the students and the families. And so that's what we've been participating in for the last long time. My first book, Kisses from Katie, is probably what I'm best known for. And it's really just a chronicle of the story. I moved to Uganda when I was 18, and I thought I was going to be there for a year, doing a gap year from between high school and college. I had volunteered to work at an orphanage, and was excited to spend a year there. Love Uganda, love the people, was completely enamored with just Uganda's a beautiful place, a really kind, hospitable, welcoming, warm culture, and just really, really fell in love with the kids that I was working with, but also was really surprised to learn that a lot of the children at the orphanage where I was working had living parents. And so the more questions I began asking, the more I learned that in East Africa, about 80% of children who are living in institutions have at least one living parent. Now that's changing. There's a big push in the government to try to go more toward foster care and family preservation, which is amazing. But at the time, like I said, this was probably almost 17 years ago. Lots and lots of kids were living in institutions because that was really the only way that they could get help. And so school in Uganda is not free. School fees can be really expensive, and especially for large families who live rurally are not usually able to pay for school. And so a lot of these kids were being sent to live at the orphanage because their families loved them, wanted them, cared about them, but felt that they would have a better life and better opportunities by coming to live in an orphanage. And this was just really surprising to me, but also very sad to me. And so I just began to ask questions of the community members that I was coming to know and love, and decided kind of on a whim, like, I'm going to pay for these 2 little girls that I had been in relationship with. I'm going to pay for them to go to school so that they can continue living with their grandmother. And basically, I called home and I shared this with my parents, and they shared it with their friends. And, my parents said, like, oh, is there more of a need for that? Like, we could pay for a couple kids to go to school. And then a couple of their friends were like, well, that sounds cool. We could pay for a couple kids to go to school. And within my first year of living in Uganda, I was raising money and paying for about 40 children to go to school. And so really felt the Lord impress upon my heart to create a nonprofit, and felt like that was really my life's work. So I founded Amazima. That's the Luganda word for truth. I just really felt compelled that I wanted these kids and their families to know the truth of who Jesus was, and who he created them to be, and how valued and precious they were to him. And so Amazima grew and grew and grew. I started hiring my friends from the community to help me. And today we've got about 300 staff, and then we have 2 school campuses where children come. They learn about Jesus. They learn academics. Obviously, we do community engagement where we try to stay really involved with their families and help their families out with job trainings. And we do farming trainings, and we do community Bible studies, and we do some medical relief, really trying to empower and disciple the whole family as opposed to removing the child from the family. So that's kind of my backstory in a nutshell, I guess. I did meet my husband in Uganda. He was working with a different missions organization there. As God would have it, funnily enough, we are from about 20 minutes away from each other in Tennessee. So we're from like the same area, but never knew each other until we moved to Uganda and met there. Over the course of our years there, we did adopt 13 daughters, and then we had 2 babies who are both boys. So that's our big family, and that's our story.
It's so fun to hear you share it because I was first introduced to you as in not face to face, but I was told about your book, Kisses from Katie. And so I have to say, when I was a teenager, just right after I accepted Christ, I went on my first missions trip and I was like, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to do mission work. And I used to say a lot, kind of in jest, but not totally in jest, that if I could choose, I'm like, I just want to move to Africa and live in a mud hut and just adopt a bunch of kids. And that's going to be my life. That's where you'll find me. And so when I met my husband, I was actually 16 when I met my husband. And so I got married at 18. And it became very clear that he did not have that same calling to move to a mud hut with me. But our joke in our marriage, when your book came out and we had heard about the book, people who knew me were like, you should definitely read this book. And my husband was like, you should definitely not read this book. So it was this ongoing joke that he was like, no, you can't, because then you're going to be like, now we got to go. And yeah, so I waited a long time because I genuinely was like, God, what if this stirs this discontent? Like, I know that I'm where you have me and I don't know. And so when I finally read your book, you describe in that book this, I believe you had flown home and you were flying back to Uganda. And it was this sense when the plane landed of like, I'm home. Like, this is where God has called me. And interestingly enough, that moment in the book, God spoke so clearly to me because exactly what you described in that moment is how I have felt every time we've landed back in Boston, like in New England, is this sense of like, this is your mission field. Like, I have called you to the Northeast. And so it's kind of been a running joke. But then I told my husband, I was like, all that time, you were telling me not to read the book. And actually it just like affirmed this call to where we are. But the sweetest thing is literally a few weeks ago, after all of those years, it's been a few years. We've now been married. This is 21 years for us. I got to go on my first trip to Africa. And yeah, and it was incredible. So when I saw you on that, Laura had booked for us to do this interview, I was like, that's such great timing because it's like,
yeah, that's so cool.
After all those years. So I am one, and I'm sure many others that were just encouraged through sort of that big part of your story. But with Hey Girl, we say a lot that part of our purpose is to encourage our listeners to run their race in their place. And the idea of where has God called you right now? Like, because there are some times in our life that feels big and it even feels important. And then there are some times in our lives where we're like, okay, is this really what you've called me to? But what does it look like for us to be faithful in that? And so I appreciate so much the books you've written. I've read 2 out of 3, and I will for sure read your Safe All Along. But actually, one of the reasons I was so excited to have you come on is I know that you've made this major transition in your life, moving, you said you're 15 years in Uganda and now you're stateside. And so I wonder if you could share with us a little about what does it look like in your journey to be known for something so like in such a big way. I think of people like who pastor churches who transition from major title roles, and God obviously your calling remains, but God shifts your assignment. Like, what has that been like for you? And especially in terms of just being able to adjust your run to this, this different pace, this different place that God has you, that I'm sure is very, very different than where you've been for the last 15 years.
Yeah, it's so different. And we made the move kind of unexpectedly. There were just a lot of different things going on. And we were in the US on what was supposed to be a 3-week trip. And we extended that trip, and then we extended the trip again. And then we just kind of kept extending. And then it was like, okay, we're going to stay for a year. Okay, maybe we'll stay for 2. And so I think at first I didn't let myself adjust because I really, really loved my life and my role and my run, as you would say, like in Uganda. And so I didn't want to adjust to here, but it has been that question of, okay, Lord, I don't want to just be where I want to be. I want to be faithful where you have me. And God has made it very clear that, even on days when this is not the place I might rather be, this is the place where he has our family right now. And so this is the place where he has me, and I'm able to still serve Amazima here, but in a really different capacity. I'm able to still serve my family, obviously, because they're here as well. And so it has been a really, really challenging adjustment. And that was something I write about it even in my second book, Daring to Hope, just that in those early years of life and ministry, like my very early adulthood years, God did really big things. I mean, he grew this big ministry, and then I had this big family, and we were just really involved in our community. And I was very well known both in our local community and then kind of through the book, very, very well known in kind of these evangelical circles. And then really felt called by God to take a step back, raised up some other leadership in my organization, Amazima. So I was still working there, but I was not the country director anymore because I really felt called to focus on my family. I was homeschooling some of our children and just really felt like that was my primary ministry. And so then for the next many years, most of my ministry took place inside my home, where nobody was seeing it and nobody was applauding it. And there was not this big recognition. And so I feel like God kind of already took me through that transition a little bit while we were still in Uganda. And for me, I mean, at first that was obviously super challenging, but it also taught me just to receive God seeing me and God knowing these places of my heart that felt so unseen by the world, and God delighting in me and celebrating over me, and really taught me to kind of shift from needing the approval of everybody else to going okay, Lord, am I being faithful to you? And do I have your approval in this? And so being in the US has felt a little bit like more of kind of that same thing. It's just felt smaller, if you will. There's something about, and I'm sure as you've wrestled with wanting to go overseas too, there's something, I think we can think of missions as a little bit glamorous, or a little bit, this is more important for the kingdom, or this is a little bit, a little bit grittier work. This is a little more purposeful. I think being back in the US, I really struggled with feeling very purposeless, and anybody would go no, you have so many kids, lots of purpose. But in Uganda, our home was just, people were in and out of it every single day. And it was really, people had needs that were really, really easy to meet quickly, right? You don't have any food. Here you can have some of mine. You can't afford to go to school. Okay, we can pay for your school fees. It was easy to meet people's needs. And then being here, we first moved into a community where people didn't seem to have any needs. Of course they did. They're just so much more, it was an affluent community. And so people did have needs, but they were so much more hidden. They weren't these easy needs to meet, hey, I'm hungry. And so I think I just struggled to kind of find my purpose and figure out how to plug in and feel like, okay, God, are you just like done using my life? Like, was that kind of it, and just have really had to wrestle through like, okay, Lord, what does it look like to still live with a kingdom mindset and a kingdom purpose, to still love you, to still love the people that you've placed in my life in this like really different context?
You're speaking so much to something that is a big part of my heart is, and I think some of it is God's had to do a big work in my heart in this. And that's this idea of our overarching calling, like as children of God, that we are called to. I like to boil it down to know God and to make him known. Like this is what we're called to do. And that there's just so many different assignments within that calling, and they can change so many times throughout our life. And I think one of the things I appreciate hearing you share is your just willingness and surrender to adjust as those assignments kept shifting. Like there was the assignment to run this huge organization, but then it was time to shift into focusing with your kids in your home. And now added to that, sort of this relocation, I'm sure a major culture shock going from Uganda to the States. But just what you said is one of those things I feel like we all need to remind ourselves that there is no greater or lesser kingdom call. Like if we are being faithful to that, and whatever I'm doing, if it's kids hanging off of me, if it's, single young women who are, just living that day to day and knowing God and making him known wherever he's placed them, just how that's the beauty of that's all mission work. Like we're all on mission. And so I just appreciate so much you just sharing that, even in terms of this adjustment to recognizing where you're at now. The needs are not the same. They don't show themselves the same, but that even in Tennessee, there are people who don't know God. Now, as someone who's coming from New Hampshire, looking at Tennessee, I'm always like, whenever I go down south, I'm always like, this is like a whole nother, because you still are technically in the Bible Belt where people at least talk about knowing God. Whereas I live in the lovely land of they'll just tell you how it is. And we have a lot of towns around us that are actually considered unreached people groups based on like how they build statistics for that. But I almost think where you live in some ways is more challenging, because when people think that they know God, but they don't really have that relationship with him, how do you sort of navigate that with them? Like you said, when they don't even know their own needs, but they have needs, like how do you serve? And so for you, just practically speaking, what does that look like right now? You posted something the other day that popped up on my feed, and I was like, I feel like if we lived closer, we would be friends, because it had to do with this idea of hosting and like, let's get away from this having to be a show and like Pinterest worthy, but just inviting people into our space, into the mess, into whatever it looks like. And I definitely have such a heart for that. Also, I'm like a terrible cook and all of these things that I'm like, no one is going to come to my house impressed with the meal. Let's be real. But what does it look like for you in Tennessee right now in terms of, like you said, ways that you have found to serve the people around you?
That's great. Yeah, a lot of people loved that post. I was honestly surprised by just how quick people were to respond. But I think that was really hard for me moving here. Uganda is a super communal culture. And like I mentioned earlier, like people were in and out of our house all the time, and impromptu meals were not unusual. And so my husband was pastoring our church, but he had his little office kind of in our backyard. And so there were people in and out all the time meeting with him. And it was just not unusual to just say like, hey, are you staying for dinner? And just have people in our space and around kind of last minute all the time. And so it was never it wasn't like I did clean up the house before people came over or that I had a fancy meal prepared. It was just whatever we were doing that day or whatever we were having. And so it was really hard for me in moving here to feel like, oh, okay, if we're going to get together, it's going to need to be this like scheduled in advance thing. Not a lot of impromptu things happening. I started to feel the pressure of like, oh, my house needs to look a certain way or the food needs to be a certain way. But I think there is ministry in just being the first to be vulnerable and say like, I'm going to let you come over to my house when it's not picked up or when the food is not impressive. Some of my favorite, we have found an awesome church community that's become really dear to us, where I feel like I've been able to be vulnerable and say like, you can come over right now, even if, it isn't clean or there isn't food, or where I've been able to say like, hey, stay for dinner. Like I don't know what we're going to have. I'm going to pull some leftovers out of the fridge. Right. But I've had really, really sweet times with people like that. And I just think about the community that I would have missed out on if I was concerned with, not like having things look a certain way. And part of it's not that I'm like some expert or master at this. It's because part of it was I was so desperate for friends. Like we moved here, we didn't know anybody. Like we were so terribly lonely. And I remember this one time when this lady from church texted me. I wasn't home. I was on my way to the grocery store. She texted me and was like, hey, I was in your area. I was going to stop by. Is that okay? And I was like, yep. Come on over. I like turned around from the grocery store. I raced home. The house was a total disaster. She got there like 2 minutes after me, but I was like so desperate to have a friend that I was like, I'm not going to say no because, people don't usually stop by. So like, I'm just going to make it happen. And we were laughing about like kids' toys I'd been out of town the day before. So it was just like out of control, but she has become like one of my closest friends here. And I think that, people want vulnerability and they want connection. And so my husband laughs at me because he calls them my experiments, but I've just been kind of experimenting for the last year and a half of like, okay, how do we cultivate community? Like what will happen if I show up at small group in my pajamas? Like, will everybody else then feel the freedom to show up at small group in their pajamas? Like, I don't know. I think that just to kind of let our guard down first is one way that people really need to be served, because a lot of us just feel, that we need to put on a certain face or act or look a certain way in order to be welcomed into community, in order to have friendships, like in order to practice hospitality. We need to have our homes look a certain way, and we need to serve the right food, right? And social media is just really not helping us squash these ideas. But people are longing for a place to be vulnerable and a place to be known. I think we are all a lot more lonely than we care to admit. And so I think sometimes just being the first to say like, yeah, you can come over while my house is messy, or you can come over while I'm still in my sweatpants, or whatever the kind of silly thing is. I think people want that and sometimes just don't know how to ask for it.
I think both of those things are such a great thought in terms of if people are like, where do I start? Is first sort of being the first to invite people into your mess. And in some ways there's a risk to that because some people embrace it. And then I've had experiences where it makes people legitimately uncomfortable and again, that could be a culture difference even to where we live in the country from each other, because I'm in a much colder, like just a very different environment, but it's still like somebody's got to take that first step. And then I love the idea of experiments, like just try things. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but you'll never know unless you give it a shot. So.
Right. I even said to a girlfriend, I don't know, it's been a couple months, but she said like, hey, are you able to hang out on this day? And I was like, well, it's the only day I have like set aside to grocery shop. Do you want to go to the grocery store with me? And she said, yeah. And I didn't know. I thought like, this is weird. People don't go to the grocery store together, but like she wanted to go to the grocery store with me. And then even just a couple weeks ago, I have a friend who has kids the same age as my little guys who also homeschools. And so we try to see each other like once a week. And 1 week I go to her house and 1 week she comes to my house. And So a couple weeks ago, we got to talking, and we're just talking about, I think this is a relatable thing to everybody, but we were just talking about how it seems like I can get my laundry into the washing machine and wash it, and then I can get it into the dryer and dry it, and then I get it out, and it just sits in the pile forever. I put the pile on the bed, like I'm going to fold it and put it away later, but then I put the pile from the bed to the floor, and then eventually I'm just like digging through the pile on the floor to get the clean clothes that I want to wear, and it's back in the laundry. Like it never kind of gets back into the dresser. I don't know if that's relatable, but I was sharing it with her, and she was saying the same thing. She was like, oh my gosh, me too. So then later she left, and I like sent her a picture of the giant laundry pile on my floor. Well, we decided, okay, so how about when we get together on Wednesday, like if we're at your house, we'll fold your laundry, and if we're at my house, we'll fold my laundry. So we haven't done it yet, but now we're going to start folding laundry together. I think just, yeah, it is like a giant, it's like, hey, do you want to do this with me? And if you don't, like, that's okay. But maybe you will. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we're all just waiting for somebody else to ask.
Yeah, first of all, I love the laundry folding thing. That's fantastic. And I think you're right. I think in a lot of ways, having someone to break the ice, not being afraid of being creative in mundane ways. Like, why do we, every time we get together, have to be this extravagant? What if we actually like did something on our to-do list that sits there forever, or whatever it is? Like, let's use this time together to, I like to go for walks a lot. That's a way that I connect with friends, is like, I need to get out and go for a walk. Do you want to go for a walk with me? Let's just go. And then you can walk and talk for however long. So no, community is huge. I think connecting with people and just inviting people into your life is a beautiful thing. It's something that I've appreciated, especially reading your last book, which you were just talking about. I resonated so much and just appreciated your story of your home just being a place where people were welcomed to come in. And I love to say, like, I love most when my house just has a revolving door. Like, I just love it. I'm like, everybody come, let's do it. So yeah, I think all really good and practical ideas. I have an interesting question for you, because you mentioned you were 18 when you went to Uganda that first time. Obviously, some big things in your life. It's been years since then. If you could go back to 18-year-old Katie, is there anything that you would want to encourage her with at that age, stepping into what you had no idea what was coming, but something that you'd be like, hey, just so you know?
Right. Wow. There are so many things. Honestly, there are probably a lot of things that I could tell 18-year-old Katie. I guess, one, just the biggest one would probably be like, hey, this is going to be really hard, but it's going to be really worth it. Man, there were so many times where it was like, this is too hard. But God and his faithfulness, and the ways that he just continued to show up and meet me and meet our family and provide for us in all the different hard things, and the way that he grew me in relationship with him because of those hard things was absolutely worth it. I think another thing that I would really just encourage a younger version of myself is to just be a better learner. And I get the opportunity now to say this to a lot of people. I have a lot of people who reach out and say like, okay, I want to go on a mission trip, or I'm interested in doing this, or I'm young and want to move overseas. And I think there is something about the American culture that instills in us, you can do whatever you want to do and you can be whatever you want to be. And there's something really great and empowering about that, and also something really kind of arrogant and not great about that. And so there's a way in which we can kind of show up thinking like, I know some things, and I know how to do this better even, maybe. And so I had the opportunity to learn a ton in my first year in Uganda. I lived with a Ugandan family, which I'm super grateful for. They were very gracious as I made like every cultural mistake in the book. But I love to encourage people to show up just kind of going, okay, I'm new here, and therefore I know nothing about this place, this culture, this people. What can I learn? And I think that that learning posture is going to get us really far in relationship, in missions, in service, whatever it is. I think we need to learn to be learners. And so I would like to go back and encourage my younger self, like, you just don't know quite as much as you think you know. Which we probably all want to tell our 18-year-old self that in like some form or fashion, right? Like, you just don't know everything you think you know.
It's so true. I also think like that is, regardless of whether you're 18, that is just a good word at every age, like to all of us at every stage. I've been thinking about this as someone who's like, I'm officially middle-aged now. Like, here we are. It has arrived. And all of the weird things that happen when you're in middle age, like I'm getting to learn all sorts of things. But just that, I think the thing that strikes me at this age is I thought when I got to this age that I would have more figured out. But I feel like the older I get, the more I realize I don't have figured out. And I do, just that teaching people, because if you learn it younger, I feel like you just get better at it, is learning to learn and continue to be that. And you mentioned when you were first over in Uganda, you talked about just asking a lot of questions. And I think that's such a great place to start, is learn to ask good questions and then listen to the answers. Like, there's that temptation of like, I'm going to ask a question, but then I can't wait to tell you my answer to the question.
Oh, so guilty. Yes, absolutely. That's so good.
So yeah, asking really good questions. This is total side note, but I have to ask because it's one of my favorite things to hear from missionaries or people on the mission field. Do you have a favorite cultural, like, whoops that you did in your time in Uganda? That is that one that you're like, oh, that's embarrassing to think back on.
I mean, I have so many. One that's really funny is in learning the local language. There are certain in Luganda, the tone of your voice and like the inflection and the emphasis that you put on different syllables of words also matters. And so the word could kind of sound the same, but if you emphasize a different part of the word, you're saying it wrong. And so the word water and poop are really close. And the phrase for "you look nice today" and "you are biting me" are really close. And so there were multiple times as I was kind of learning how to put the inflection on the right syllable and emphasize in the certain way, but the words were the same. There were many times I asked for poop instead of water. And there were many times where I tried to compliment someone and tell them they looked nice today and said, "You are biting me." And man, the looks you get when you say those ones wrong. And sometimes people would figure out that I was actually asking the other thing or saying the other thing, and they would just laugh at me. But man, sometimes especially little kids in my class, I would try to say that they looked nice, but I would say, "You were biting me." And man, they would just look at me like, no.
Yeah. So,
yeah, my kids tease me about that to this day.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad I asked that question.
It's a good question. And it's one I honestly don't get asked very much. So you now have like really insider info.
Oh, I love it. Literally every missionary, those stories cracked me up because we were just in Togo. And when we were in Togo, I was just walking in the village that we were in, and this woman came out and she had this huge smile on her face. Like, she was just, you could tell, ecstatic about whatever. And she comes up to me and then just like out loud is like, "Hello." And I was like, "Oh," I was like, "Hi, how are you?" And she's like, "Thank you." And then she like walks back in, and I stopped and I was like, that is probably exactly how I sound when I try to speak their language. Is like, I get so excited that I'm like, I have learned these words and I'm going to use them in every,
I'm just going to say it.
and I'm just going to say it and hope it fits. So yeah, that's a lot of fun. Well, before we wrap up, two quick questions for you. And this is right now in this season of life. First of all, what is something that you are doing right now that's really feeding your relationship with Jesus? Like this is something I'm really connecting a place, a habit, whatever it is. And then the second is, what are you doing right now that is caring for your physical being, like just caring for your body right now?
Great questions. I just released a book called Safe All Along that you have mentioned. And so writing for me is just like really a way that I connect with Jesus. And so I think I'm still kind of in the figuring out place because I'm not really writing anything right now for the sake of being published. I've kind of wrapped that up, but that has really characterized the last year and a half of being in the States as I was also working on this writing project. And so I felt like that was keeping me really connected and tied in to the Lord and having to ask him, okay, what would you have me say here? And having to kind of be taught before I could write it out. And so I'm still trying to just cultivate a daily habit of writing, whether that's writing out my prayers or sometimes copying scripture. But I feel like my mind is I'm just like so easily distracted. I can be praying and then the next minute I'm like writing my grocery list in my head. So it really helps me to just like write out my prayers and write out the scripture I'm reading or write out my responses to the scripture I'm reading. So I would say that just cultivating again a daily habit of writing, even though I've gotten kind of out of the habit of writing now that the book has launched, is something that I'm starting to try to do to stay really connected to Jesus, and that really helps me. And then as far as caring for my physical body, the weather is so nice in Tennessee right now. And so I just have told myself, like, I'm going to go outside every day. And sometimes that means going on a walk with the dog. Sometimes I get to like this point on the day, I've been working and on my computer almost all day. So I might just have to go like sit outside for a minute before the kids get home from school, but just trying to be like outside and in the sunshine and in the fresh air for a little bit every day. I feel like it's good for my physical body, but it also just feels like such just an exhale for my soul and such a way to just appreciate God and the beauty that he's put all around us in nature too.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Katie, it's been so good to sit here and chat with you, to hear more of your story. And I know our listeners we'll link all the different places that they can find you and follow you. But just thank you for your time today. And thank you for your willingness and just trusting us with your story so we could share it with others.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for taking the time to listen today. You make every hour spent recording in this closet worth it. Also, a huge thanks to Tony from IOK Productions for stepping in as our new editor and making all of those hours recording sound incredible. I can't wait to do this again next week. Bye, girl.